Good morning. My name's Mike Lawrence. I enjoy church. I love the laughter we have in church because I think joy translates into laughter. Well, thank you for being a part of this place this morning, for giving me joy by being here and showing up. We're in a series called F.A.C.E.S. It's about relationships because I think God cares about relationships. When Jesus was once asked, hey, of all the commandments in the Bible, what's the most important? Let's boil it down. Jesus couldn't boil it down to one. He boiled it down to two. Because I think for Jesus, it's two sides of the same coin. The most important commandment is to listen. The Lord your God is one, is the one and only Lord. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Before anyone can speak, he says, and the second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. Jesus boils down all the commandments to relationship. Your relationship with God and your relationship with people. How we love God and how we love people. Those are all the commandments can be summarized into that because relationships matter. So we're doing a series on how to have relationships. How to be able to talk to fully forgive somebody. How to actually accept an individual. How to engage in a courageous conversation. How to empower people with encouragement, and how to selflessly serve the people in the world around us. This is just about loving people and building relationships, whether they agree with us or not. And isn't it a thing we need now in our nation? I think in our nation, our world, we have got to get to a point where we can treat one another with love. Think of all the arguments we're having over politics and sexual orientation and war. Our diplomats can't even get together over an economy that impacts the lives of millions of people around the world. We as Christians should be on the forefront of examples of how to love people and engage people in the conversation, even if we don't agree. This is what we're talking about. What I want to talk about today is the ability to have a courageous conversation. A courageous conversation is a difficult discussion that you need to have someone and you don't know what the outcome's going to be. Maybe you need to reveal something that you're afraid is going to upset them. Or maybe they've done something that's upset you. Or maybe there's a divide in the relationship and you're trying to build a bridge, but you just can't predict what's going to happen. And so you have to kind of build up the courage to engage in that conversation. We heard about that this morning. Talk about a courageous conversation from a young woman who texts her dad thinking she's going to be rejected by him and instead discovers love. Because she had that courageous conversation. Look at all the lives that were impacted. Look at the family that was able to stay together in unity. Look at the young life that entered this world. Because she took the courage to have a conversation when she didn't know what the outcome was going to be. That's what we need. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. So we're going to talk this morning about having these type of conversations. They're not your ordinary conversations. These are the really hard conversations. Though the principles we'll talk about today do help in any conversation. You know, if you're, by the end of this message, you're thinking, man, I need to have a really courageous conversation. I just don't know how to do it. You could reach out to a pastor, or you could have a conversation with your faith group leader. We could try to coach you through that. You may need a third party present to have that type of courageous conversation. And we can help connect you in order to do that. But Christians need to lead the way on having courageous conversations with people when we don't know what the outcome is going to be. Because Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. They will be called children of God. That's what we need to walk through. So this morning, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk us through one of the most awkward ministry moments Jesus had in his whole career. I'm going to tap into some advice from an ancient civil government leader. And then I'm going to bring it all together by talking about business, school, and Facebook. Okay? So kind of hang in there with me on this. This is a challenge this morning, right? So God, I just want to pray that in this room this morning, your presence has already been felt. So continue, Father. Speak through me. Right into the hearts of people. God, I love those moments when an individual thinks, how did he know that? When they have this feeling that you're talking right to them. You're the God of the universe, and yet you know every single person in this room. Here and in Framingham, you love us because you're our creator. Speak through me, God, with such power and love that lives are changed like they were when Jesus walked the earth. Because I believe that that can happen. I love you and I trust you. You're my Father. Amen. I want to set the scene a little bit for this encounter. So Jesus returns to the Mount of Olives. That's an actual location. But early the next morning, he was back again at the temple. The temple was a place of religious worship. It was a center. There was only one in the whole nation. Okay? So people would come from all over Israel. They'd go on long journeys from different places of the world just to get to the temple to worship. All right? A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and he talked to them, because that's what religious leaders did. They would gather at places in the temple, open air, or there are places with a protective colonnade over them, and they would just start to have like a spontaneous seminar, like a TED Talk, right, at the moment. And as Jesus was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. All right, so here we have a group of religious leaders who drag a woman into the most religious place in Jerusalem before a crowd of religious people and set her down in front of the most popular religious teachers of the day to accuse her of adultery. What a horrific moment. As a Christian, as a religious leader, as one who loves history and reads about it, I'm always amazed at some of the most horrific things that have happened by religious people driven by religious convictions. I recognize that. It happens. And we have a scene in our own Bible. The Bible recognizes that. This poor woman is caught in this moment. You know, it always makes me think through some questions like, how do you catch a person in the act of adultery? What motivates you to charge into the bedroom to catch somebody? And I ask myself the question, doesn't adultery involve two people? Where's the other person? And honestly, you're supposed to the accuser is supposed to be someone directly related to the person. Where's the spouse? One of them, if not both of them, is supposed to be married in order to commit adultery. This is a horrible situation. This is a setup. This woman is being used by people to set up Jesus. We're going to see this happen. All right? And so here we have this crowd, a small group of people, all religious, standing around in the temple, a religious place where you can hear the acts of worship going on around you. And this woman is suffering this deep humiliation in a place where she's supposed to be trying to find a relationship with God. This is why some people don't come to church, because they're afraid of this happening to them. Right? Fortunately, Jesus is in the middle of the situation. Right? So I love this. So they put her in front of the crowd, and teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. That's an actual law. It's in our Bible, right? It's a long story about why it's there. It's an ancient law that had been written thousands of years before Jesus was even born. But it was on the books. It's kind of like those laws that stand in the background in different states or in our nation that have just been hanging around for a long time. Because they're trying to trap Jesus into saying something they could use against him. There's not even a good motivation to the religious leaders. It's not like they care about this woman and the destruction that's being caused by the choices that she and this other person have made. They don't care about that. She's a prop to be used to try to trap Jesus. Right? And they were trying to get him to say something they could use against him, but Jesus stooped down and wrote dust in his fingers. So here's some things. They're absolutely correct. It is a law, right? It's on the books. It's in the Bible. They could read it, right? What the law said, here's the thing. The law said that the man and the woman had to be brought out. So they're not even obeying the very law that they're trying to uphold and try to bring before Jesus. It says something about their motivation. You know, and it's one of those things, like if Jesus were really believed in justice, he has to support the law, right? And it's an immoral act. As a religious teacher, he's got to recognize the fact that this is morally wrong. So to build in the case, come on, man, if you believe in justice, it's the law. If you're a religious teacher, it's immoral. What are you going to do? They're trying to catch him in his bind, because if Jesus says, yes, she should be stoned in front of all these people, the religious leaders go, wow, so much for love and compassion that you've been preaching. And yet if Jesus says no in front of all these people, they're like, a religious leader who doesn't believe in the law, and you want to listen to him? What a horrific situation, right? And then Jesus does the most unexpected thing. He just stoops down and starts doodling in the sand. A lot of people conjecture over what he was doodling. I don't think it matters. I think what Jesus was doing was distracting the crowd from this woman. He's diffusing the emotions because he's choosing not to respond right away. I think Jesus is taking a deep breath. I think he's collecting his thoughts and he's managing his own emotions, because we know Jesus has emotions. The Bible is very clear about that. I can imagine he is mad at this moment. But rather than respond quickly, rashly, he chooses to breathe. And everyone's looking at what he does. Okay. So now the story goes on. It says they kept demanding an answer. So these guys are not going to give up. So Jesus stood up again and said something. All right. You know what Jesus just said? He goes, you're absolutely correct. It is the law. All right. All right. But let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Because what Jesus is recognizing is that if you really read the law, and Jesus knew the law pretty intimately, not only was the man supposed to be there with the woman, but the community was supposed to kill the person. Jesus is saying to the people gathered around him, if this is what you want, you need to take responsibility for it. But because Jesus knew the law, he also knew the ancient law had a lot of other reasons to be stoned, like disobeying your parents. Okay, who qualifies for that one? Jesus is basically saying, you want justice for this. Great. How many of you will qualify for the next execution? And then he just goes back down to doodling in the sand. Jesus forced a question that caused him to stop and to think about this. Because if you're going to be the judge, you need to be able to live up to the law, right? And he actually asks a question that changes a moment of judgment and anger into mercy, doesn't it? He causes them to reflect on their own soul. And look what happens. I love this. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest. Because wisdom should come with gray hair. I hope so. Right. Wisdom should come with gray hair. And they realize, I think some of them get kind of like, what in the world are we thinking? What are we doing in this moment? Diffuses the whole situation, and only Jesus is left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Jesus took a moment that could have ended with the death of a human being and turns it around into a self-reflection that leads to mercy and forgiveness. Isn't it remarkable how he does this? Just with a thoughtful, reflective question. And so then the story finishes up. Then Jesus stood up again and he says to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? Now, the only person qualified to throw a stone looks at her and says, neither do I. Isn't that remarkable? And then he says, go and sin no more. He recognizes what she did was wrong. It was immoral. She was guilty. But what she needed wasn't a stone, but a path to forgiveness, a way of healing. I think this is one of those moments when Jesus looked and he thought, she's been humiliated, she's been betrayed, and she's been abused. Does she really need a rock? Or does she need a way out? And he took this moment where these people were right, and he transforms the moment and saves a soul. Saves her life, and I believe saves her soul. I don't think she'd ever forget this in her lifetime. And if somebody treated you like that and saved you in a moment like that, do you really think you'd be the same person afterwards? Rather than respond to their violence with anger, he chose to respond thoughtfully. He chose to respond with reflection and to lay out a question that would get them to think differently. He diffused this dangerous, potentially violent situation with a question. He didn't avoid the discussion. He entered into it, right? He entered into it thoughtfully, not rashly. He entered into it compassionately, not with anger. He diffused violence with wisdom, and he did it with 3 simple steps. He listened before he spoke. He reflected what he heard and responded thoughtfully with compassion. If we could do those three things, imagine how our world would be different. If we could listen before we speak, if we could reflect on what we've heard, if we could respond with compassion and not anger, imagine how our world would be different. And I think Jesus gives us a model to follow. So years ago, because I kind of grew up with the anger gene. I'm a human being, right? And I had to learn how to deal with my own anger and how to do it. So I took the book of Proverbs. It's a book towards the middle of our Bible. It's got these wonderful sayings of wisdom. They're stated in pithy ways to help you remember them. There's 31 chapters in the book. And so I decided every day I was going to read a chapter. And I took my computer and as I read through, whenever I read a verse, I thought, oh, I started to categorize it. I categorize it by relationships. I categorize it with conflict, with communication, with anger, with love, with self-control, with sexual immorality, with financial management. I just kind of like categorized it as I went through it. And I was amazed at how many of them dealt with communication and conflict. So what I'd like to do is take this model of Jesus, of listening, reflecting, and responding, and just show you the wisdom that comes out of this ancient civil leader, because it was a king named Solomon, David's son, who wrote most of these. This is a guy that when he prayed to God and God said, I'll give you whatever you want as king, he said, great, I'd like to have some wisdom. And so God gave him wisdom. And he wrote a lot of it down. So I just took it and I started to apply it to my communication in order to do this. And it's like to unpackage, sort of like look at this model from the light of this wisdom and kind of consider what it might be like in some contemporary situations. So if the first step to any conversation is the commitment to listen, I read this right out of the Proverbs. Spouting off before listening to the facts is both shameful and foolish. Well, that's pretty direct. What I learned about that is that my ignorance often would leak out of my mouth. And just by opening and speaking quickly, before I understood the situation, before I had all the facts, before I knew why a person acted the way they did, I often made the situation worse instead of better. That the first act to a courageous conversation is loving a person enough to actually listen. Because talking before we listen implies that you know everything about the situation. You know everything about the person and why they did what they did. You understand completely their motivation and why they did what they did. You know what that's called? Omniscience. That's a God quality. When we think before we speak that we understand everything that happened in this situation, that we are qualified to judge, then kind of we're thinking we're God-like. Listening recognizes with humility my human limitation, and I may not understand everything, and so I should probably listen before I speak so that what I say actually can help. It helps bring insight into someone's motivation and perspective. And by listening, what was really interesting, the more I listened, the more I could choose my emotions and how I would respond. I may feel anger initially, but as I listened, I often found that anger diffuse and kind of evaporate, and different emotions come, like compassion, into the moment. You know, it's like you just finished a joint presentation and your partner kept cutting you off, dominated the discussion, disagreed with you in front of the people in front of this. You're trying to seal the contract. What in the world is he doing in front of these people? And you want to make the situation worse. When the presentation for the contract is over and you both left the room, he was so angry at you, he wouldn't speak to you. You're going to be kidding me. What a jerk. Now you have a choice. You could go tell him off. Shout it out in the parking lot. You've done it before with your partner. Or you could take a deep breath, let the moment go, and come back later and simply say, can you explain to me why you kept cutting me off in front of people when I was trying to make the presentation? Two different responses. One assumes you know exactly what happened and how to respond. The other one says, well, maybe I should listen and try to find out what their motivation is. Or maybe it's like, you know, in school. You can't stand her in class. Nobody can stand her in class. She's the know-it-all, always raising her hand, shouting out the questions, asking about homework when the teacher forgets, reminding about the test. I mean, nobody likes her because she's always showing off in class. And now you have a choice. You could sit close enough in the lunchroom because nobody else sits with her, but you could sit at a different table. You don't want to be seen with her, with your friends. And you could talk loudly enough about her behavior so that she overhears you and maybe she'll change. Or you could have the courage to take your lunch, to sit down across from her and introduce yourself. And just to start asking simple questions. Who she is, where'd she come from, what's home like, what does she like about school? You could start by just getting to know her a little bit to choose how you want to respond. Or maybe it's that person you don't know why you're still friends on Facebook. Because whenever you talk about things you do at church, they always got a snide comment. Or the stuff that shows up on your feed from her posts are posts that are negative about Christians, anti-religious, mocking churches. Now, you know what? You could just unfriend her. Why deal with it and walk away from the situation? You could private message her and say, hey, can we grab coffee? I'm kind of wondering what's going on, if everything's okay. Two different responses. When we choose to listen first, and then Jesus teaches us to reflect in order to consider what might be going on and how to deal with that. And that ancient wisdom was present there too. The heart of the godly thinks carefully before speaking. The mouth of the wicked overflows with evil words. When Solomon speaks, he often casts things in these broad sort of opposites to get your attention. And basically what he's saying is like a good person really thinks about what they're going to say before they say it. People who just spout out words often have negative impact. Because reflection is looking at a situation from another person's perspective and asking questions like, what shaped them to respond like this? How have I contributed to the situation to make it this way? How can I identify with this person? Isn't that what Jesus did? Jesus, with a simple question, forced religious leaders to think carefully, to respond differently, to identify with the woman, to take responsibility for the situation, to consider what they would want if they were in her situation, rather than acting quickly with anger, to pull back and to reflect. Maybe what you discover from the conversation with him, he dominated the presentation because the deal changed. He was angry with you because he'd been emailing you all weekend. It's an important contract, and you didn't respond. And so he did the only thing he knew what to do. In the moment, he just took control of the presentation because nobody wanted the deal to be lost. There was a lot of money involved. Oh. Maybe by hanging out with her at lunchtime and getting to know her a little better, what you discover is that she's the first person in her family who has the opportunity to go to college. Her parents don't make a lot of money. They're so anxious about her getting into college, and she's so anxious about getting into college that the whole family knows that she needs a scholarship. She's being driven at home to get good grades. She's responding the way she's responding in class out of anxiety that she doesn't know the answer, and she's afraid that she doesn't know enough, and she's afraid that she's not going to be able to get a scholarship, and she's going to disappoint her family and lose an opportunity to go to college. So I'm talking. Maybe what you discover through the private messaging, she agrees to grab coffee with you. You start to do that casual sort of catch-up stuff, and then you take that courageous step and you say, you know what? You're saying things on my feed that concern me. They concern me because, religion's important to me. I get it's not important to everybody. But what you're saying makes me think that something difficult is going on that I don't understand. And she begins to cry. And she tells you the story slowly about how her brother was molested by a religious leader in her church. How in the world could there be a loving God? How could I ever trust in church? Wow. Imagine if you had unfriended her. And it all pours out on the table. You know, reflecting doesn't mean that your decision to turn off the email so that you could have a weekend with your spouse and not respond to your partner's email doesn't mean it was a wrong choice, right? It doesn't mean that she shouldn't change her behavior in class so she can make more friends. And it doesn't mean that her statements about religion are accurate or should be encouraged. Not at all. It's just that reflecting gives you the choice to look at the situation from someone else's perspective before you speak, so that your words are actually addressing the underlying issue to the conversation and not just what you perceive. It's deciding to see the world from someone else's point of view. And once we've listened to understand and we've reflected to consider, then we can really respond, right? It's at that point now we've allowed our emotions to adjust more appropriately to the situation. We thought of words that might actually address the issues underlying the conversation. And we can think about what we want to say before we say something that we regret. It's ancient wisdom. Those who are careful about what they say keep themselves out of trouble. Right? Isn't that true? I couldn't believe how much trouble I'd get into by speaking before thinking. I'm an idiot sometimes, right? But it's true, and it's ancient wisdom. For thousands of years, there's just been this thought in our Bible that those who are careful about what they say actually keep themselves out of trouble. You know that famous saying that God's given us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so should we listen twice as much as we should speak, right? So that's what Jesus did. A simple question changed the whole situation. It caused religious leaders to reflect on their own character and identify with the woman and to respond differently. Now that you've listened, now that you've reflected, now you know how to respond. Now you can look at your partner and say, you know what, I'm sorry. I did shut off the email. I mean, man, we've been working day and night, and I just wanted to take my spouse away for the weekend. I'm really sorry that I didn't tell you I was shutting off my email. You were right to be frustrated. How can we deal with this in the future? Because, man, we're working so many hours. I think both of us need to also think about our marriages. What a completely different conversation now. Or maybe what you do is, instead of mocking her for the show up in class, maybe you start to slowly suggest, you don't have to always raise your hand. I know you're struggling and feeling like you don't connect. Maybe it's because you're always speaking up and shutting other people down. You just begin to coach her about this. And maybe because your parents have been to college and you're not that worried about going to college, you have a lot of people who show you the way, you can start to come alongside her and give her some reassurances and maybe give her some coaching on how to apply for college and to try to help her out so she's not so anxious anymore. Maybe now just sitting across the table and you're hearing her past come out, you can deal with her anger better. Maybe you can be a little bit more patient with her. Maybe you can start to talk about how your church is different. Maybe you could find someone that she could talk to, a therapist who could help her deal with this type of pent-up anger that's just poisoning her life. Maybe you could start to introduce a perspective of God that she didn't have because she's so hurt from her past. Because we choose to listen, we choose to reflect on the situation before speaking, and then we choose to respond. Having a courageous conversation is a way of loving people. It's not easy, and I'm not going to assume it is, by telling through a 30-minute message with some cute illustrations. I'm not saying that I've just unpacked all your life and the difficult conversation you have to enter into. But what I'm saying is there is a way. There is a way. Jesus has showed us this. That we could be peacemakers in the world. And we could really love people so they can find healing. You may need some help talking through a courageous conversation. And often, if you've got to enter into a courageous conversation, the first place to start is by talking to somebody who's not involved. Like your faith group, like a pastor, like your ministry team leader. And just say, hey, I got to talk with this person about this situation. And maybe they can help you think of some good questions before you enter into it, to reflect on your own emotions, to consider what the outcome might be. That's what we want to do. Because a courageous conversation can help a young woman find love and support to keep a baby and to bring him into the world. And a courageous conversation can help a young woman caught in a horrific circumstance in a temple in ancient days to find forgiveness and not condemnation. And a courageous conversation can help religious leaders consider their actions and, instead of getting a reputation of being violent, learn to be merciful. How would our world be different if we could engage these conversations with love this way? And if there's anything our nation needs right now in 2019, is just a group of people who know how to have these conversations in a way that produces peace. So stop for a moment. You got the card on your chair. These are your God moments. Before you leave and you hit the flurry of life and all that's going to come crashing in on you, and you're going to forget most of what you heard here, though it was presented in a brilliant and charismatic way, right? Just take the moment to listen to God. He spoke to you this morning. I know he did. He brought a person to mind, a situation to mind, a past that you regret. Your courageous conversation could be one of seeking forgiveness. Once you write something down on this card that God sparked in your mind, I'm going to give you like a minute to just quietly sit before God and take the card with you to consider what it is he wants you to do. Because the most important thing that happened in this room is what you choose to do with it when you leave this room. Right? So, God, I pray this morning that you would speak. That you give people peace to hear you. And a pathway, God, for having that conversation that they don't want to have.